This is the Harley Quinn Fartacular, silent but deadly, with 2 T's of course. If you've been online in comic circles, or in this case even outside of it, you may have seen this comic making the rounds when it was first announced. This in late 2024. Now after that, perhaps you forgot about it or didn't pay it much mind, or maybe you were highly anticipating it. This comic ignited a firestorm of various reactions. Most of the ones you'll find that are most vocal are, "But why though?" "Disgust," or a quieter, "It's just a joke, bro." So there's a lot of knee-jerk reaction when it comes to this comic, but with 1 T, that made me want to examine the actual contents, the whole thing. What's it like? How does it land? Does it work? Why, if it doesn't work, doesn't it? And to answer the question that many people seem to have, that's the dominant one you'll see in many circles, which is this just a fetish comic? There are follow-up questions to that some may have of, is that a good or bad thing? But first, we need to get there. I can already hear some of you yelling, yes! And others going,
why so serious?
I'm Sasha, this is Casually Comics, and let's go for it. There's a lot to break down. So firstly, let's set the stage, as it were. The Harley Quinn Fartacular is positioned as an April Fool's Day book. It even has that written on the bottom here, a whole just in time for April Fool's Day. It tellingly on the back of the physical copy at least has an ad for the Harley Quinn animated series on Max, which may be an indicator of what kind of tone it may be trying to strike, or potentially the target audience, if not in terms of age, in terms of the type of humor, because the age for this is still given as 13 plus, although when one gets into it, that probably is not a high enough age rating if one doesn't want their children exposed to fetish material, because we're not going to bury the lead, it is in here. It's there both directly and indirectly. This comic is a scratch and sniff, or rub and smell, as it says on the cover, which is something that some thought was a joke, but no, you can rub it and smell it. I did rub a couple of them just when I first got it to see what it was like. Let's open it and see. Does it literally stink? The way that this works is you have to find the toots and then like rub them to get them to have a scent. And then once you do that, you can get close and... As I said in the short/TikTok, they're not that potent. They're like a light methane type of thing. The one odd thing about it, aside from the fact that this is being employed for this comic, is the fact that they're not always exactly where one might anticipate on the page. So sometimes you have to kind of go looking for them. Now, this comic, as one would expect, is just an extended fart joke. A whole bunch of different ones, but basically that's what it is. The jokes are about farts, most of them. There are a couple of others. The plot is about that too. Before we get there though, this comic actually has a little Marie Javins presents on the title page. Not all the comics have that. Marie Javins is the EIC, or editor-in-chief of DC. Why I highlight that is just because she's actually brought this comic up jokingly at certain events like Comics Pro, where she was discussing a potential DC Marvel crossover with the EIC over there, CB Cebulski. She stated, "Can I make more fart comics as part of this?" Talking about if they do a crossover, to which he says, "I don't think that's exactly what they're talking about." And then she says, "But I brought swatches." Based on exchange like that, it seems that the mindset, at least creatively behind the scenes, is that this is just a silly book that potentially people are taking too seriously. At least that's what an exchange like that seems to imply. Although others feel that's more nefarious, that people are rubbing their hands together and saying, haha, we got one over on them. Our fetish is out there. Now they have to deal with it and smell it, but only if you rub it. They don't smell if you don't rub them. What this exchange may also highlight is just a potential disconnect between the creatives and the audience, at least in regards to this comic, not in general, although some would say in general as well. Also, everything time of recording. Maybe we'll get some filthy quotes in the future. Just a question there for many people as to what is the intent of the book. Is it really just a juvenile April Fool's book about tooting, or is it a gleefully blatant, not disguised author's fetish? Because one can't claim that the authors aren't aware of the kink, because it is on display in this book, as mentioned. In fact, it ends up becoming a key plot point. In terms of that, this comic goes back and forth as to whether or not it's shaming people for having this kink or not. It really depends who it's talking about. Basically, if there's a fart joke, this book will go for it, and it doesn't necessarily have to tonally match the previous types of jokes that have been told. Now, who's on the creative team? Writing, we have Joanne Starr, who has done comedy outings for DC before, notably Fire and Ice, Welcome to Smallville. So if one read that, the humor is very similar. However, it's more centered around bodily functions, and the story itself is a bit more vignette-y. The art is by Brandon Stein. The color is by Marissa Louise. There's something else this comic can make one think of, which is that it gives off some energy of an inside joke that was shared between people who were working on something in a bit of an isolated setting that was then pushed too far, pushed out into a world that may not understand the joke, or given the different context that's coming into, it changes the meaning. Because there are so many other factors at play when one puts out a Harley book in particular. There's this idea of Harley burnout, the idea that the character hasn't been taken seriously, that people wish that she was closer to a classic version, some of them. This is also a space where people are aware of and have seen creators push their kinks out there, some more nefariously than others. Some works have famously featured a fetish element at their core, and it's worked out. An example of this people often cite is Wonder Woman. It's a different time and framework. However, it is something that can be brought up when discussing this comic and whether or not fetishism has a place inside of comic book works. There is the fact that out there is Harley Quinn fetish art specifically for this that has some fairly infamous internet lore. And just in general, there can be, in the comic fandom and just in general, a bit of tension online when it comes to things like this, where some may speculate upon negative intent, or even if this is rage bait. I've seen some people say that this was just a rage bait comic, an expensive rage bait comic, because it does have that gimmick. So there's a lot to think about, but what is the book actually about? The plot of the Fartacular is fairly simple. It can be surmised in one sentence. In fact, the author does so later. It's more like a Faulkner-esque sentence, maybe with a semicolon or two. However, we're gonna go through it so one can get a bit of the flow, the experience. But the main start of everything is that Poison Ivy breaks wind in front of Harley Quinn, and Harley thinks it's super cute and that it smells like roses. Do it again, give me some of that eau de poo. So instantly, from the first page, some people's kink darts they're going off. The signal has flashed in the sky. Because on the one hand, there is an obvious joke here that this is something that is typically considered disgusting, but Harley is into it because she's Harley. And in this instance, they're actually meant to smell nice. However, this is also a hallmark of the fetish, finding these smells that are usually unpleasant to be pleasant. There's another kind of feminist type of joke going on here, because there is an idea in some circles that women don't perform bodily functions like this, or that if they do, they should smell like roses. And there are some underlying currents of trying to make statements about female bodily functions and the patriarchy throughout this, so this seems to fall in line with that. However, all of that aside, Poison Ivy is embarrassed and not thrilled by Harley's reaction. Harley, meanwhile, says that this is a normal thing, they should be able to do anything in front of each other, and it triggers a fight. Poison Ivy storms off. So now Harley is on a quest to win her back, and also to prove to her that one can toot in front of one's significant other and that it's fine. The comic plays out in almost what feels like a series of vignettes. The first part is this argument, and then Harley discovering where she's gonna go next. One could even imagine breaking it down into a backup format and releasing it week by week. The first part of this comic is fairly tame in comparison to what's coming, and there are moments where I laughed. Not necessarily at some of the fart jokes, but the jokes are clearly constructed with setups and punchlines, and a couple of them worked for me. I know, cancelled. You know, ends up dealing with your mess. People like my girlfriend. She's got the whole weight of the world on her shoulders. She can't even laugh at something as silly as a fart no more. There's an alternate reality out there where this book is just about people loosening up and being able to laugh at farts. However, this comic does not present that thesis, and this is not that world. Although some are gonna feel that way. Just laugh. Now, at this point, the main rest of the plot kicks in, which is that Harley discovers there's an Art of the Fart exhibit at the Gotham Museum. And it's here the book takes a turn, because it pivots to making commentary explicitly about this kind of fetish. At the museum, she discovers James Joyce's love letters, or rather his lewd sex letters. They're filthy. So for those of you who do not know, James Joyce, Ulysses, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, a very historically significant author. He was also very kinky with his wife Nora. Their freak matched each other's freak, and there were a series of letters, very explicit letters that he wrote to her about all the things that they were gonna do together, and it's clear that she also wrote back in kind. They were published in 1975, so they're out there for people to read. I can say that I can't read, and you have to be very selective if you're going to read any of it, not get demonetized. But a lot of these letters are specifically about flatulence and his love of it from his wife Nora. It's all about anything to do with her butt. In terms of the museum itself, there are other actual historical pieces depicting farts shown. So here the lines start to blur a tiny bit tonal-wise, and it can be hard to pinpoint what exactly the joke is, the underlying joke outside of farts, if there is one. Some will say there isn't. Now these letters are treated as both romantic, but also as the butt, pun intended, of jokes. At some points, they're even used to slightly undermine the author's legacy or make light jokes about how could he be famous when he had this kink. That's where it's one of those moments where it's kind of shaming, but then later it pulls it back. There's a panel here where he's up against Harley's butt, sniffing her farts. And while there are tongue-in-cheek apologies, notes that are throughout, it's meant to signify that this is all outlandish humor. Perhaps seeing some of these examples, it becomes a bit clearer why for some this did not land or went too far. Now Harley decides to steal these letters to prove to Ivy that this is a thing, and that it's not weird, it can even be romantic. And that's when she's accosted by this woman who is Dutch, obviously Dutch, so that they can make Dutch oven jokes. That is pretty much the sole reason that she is. And she tells her that the letters are cursed, that James Joyce was actually a powerful magic user, and if you have these letters, you will be cursed. To toot. And so it seems that Harley is cursed and now she's lost the letters and she needs to go get them back and cure herself. And also win back Ivy, who's still not fully talking to her. At times it gets to feel as if there were just a series of fart jokes, then the plot had to be cobbled around it to make them fit. There are also some social commentary jokes. There are some attempts to take on the patriarchy by implying that that's where Ivy's shame over her bodily functions comes from. There's also jabs taken at pillars of Western literature in general as a concept, not just James Joyce. They make us ashamed. Don't give in to the patriarchy, babe.
I don't care what you do with your bodies, as long as it isn't against the law.
Men make the laws. Now, all of this is going on. There are also other panels where it would be very difficult to make the argument that they weren't sexualizing the situation. Such as here, where Harley's trying to think about how to stop herself from passing so much gas. And so she's thinking about putting a cork in her butt, which is a play of put a cork in it. But then she considers staples. But the angles that these panels are framed from with her so lovingly curvy, one would have to be incredibly naive on the creative side to not see how people would draw the connection. Or was it intentional? Is the joke that there are people who are into this? Is the joke that people take this seriously, or is there not that much thought behind it and the joke is just, hey, butts, toots? Because since this is overtly a comedy book, it must firstly be examined through that lens. Now, just in general, in terms of the Harley you're getting here, she's in more of her Deadpool-esque breaking the fourth wall. She's very manic, that kind of mode. And so you will get a couple of other jokes in there, breaking the fourth wall, some DC character jokes, that kind of thing, but they're few and far between in comparison. Now, Harley enlists the help of Plastic Man, who she ends up wearing as a containment suit. Plastic Man has been worn as clothes before. It's often been a joke. Sometimes it's a more lighthearted joke. Other times it's got a lewd connotation, especially if he gets onto a lady. It varies. How it's gonna land here is most likely gonna depend upon the context in which people are already taking this work. However, there are some things that skew it one direction. He makes a comment about liking the scent when he's forced to release some of it because it builds up because he's expanding. Pickled pizza, not bad. However, alas, they cannot cure the curse. We're all cursed now. The poor Dutch woman is cursed to have a tooty booty for all time, but Harley says that it's okay, because if these letters prove anything, it's that there's a man out there who'll still want her. So as mentioned, the fact that this kink exists is a significant plot point. And then you also have to add that layer that you can go in and rub and smell them. And the fact that they call it rub and smell instead of scratch and sniff as well. Plastic Man ends up being into the Dutch woman, cuz. But what about Harley's curse? If they can't cure it, what's gonna happen to her? Well, it turns out that she was never cursed. She was, lactose intolerant. They do build this up if you pay attention to the food she's eating and what she is drinking, and also the times when she can't eat. I was gonna play you a tune. Do-do-do-do-do-do. I think I made that more melodic than it actually was. Now, this reveal does not entirely make sense based on the level of flatulence and gas clouds they showed going on. However, this is not a work that has the most internal or realistic logic. Sometimes it's going for more of a Looney Tunes kind of vibe, which again, for some people, this may be entirely landing for them. They may be wondering, why is everybody so up in arms? Now, funnily enough, the relationship discussion at the end, where Harley comes back and she realizes that she's the one who's been being pretty intolerant of Ivy's feelings, it's decently heartfelt, and it does speak to having to respect each other's spaces inside of a relationship, and the fact that some people aren't going to feel as comfortable with some things as others, which again, could be a conversation that could be applied to kinks. So there are these little moments inside of this, just overall, it's a lot, and then the overall package turns into something else. But how do we wrap it up? To cheer Harley up, because she can't have her favorite foods anymore, Ivy toots for her, and it smells like roses. The end. So let's break this down. How is it? Putting aside whether it is a fetish comic or not for an instant, because I know for some that is the be-all end-all, but just in terms of jokes and the like. On the whole, this reads like a joke that was overextended, pushed too far beyond its confines. Something that may have been funnier or better received in a small dose. And it does feel at points like it's struggling to find a reason to keep going and to reach a full length, an overpriced length, because this is more expensive than your regular weekly comic at $7.99 US. And the scenarios that it comes up with to put these things together, they're not the most cohesive in terms of the story's own internal logic. It works, but it does feel very choppy. The plot at times feels like a necessary evil to facilitate all the fart jokes, rather than it being a solid story with a heavy emphasis on potty humor. However, it must be said this is not a mindless outing. There's clear setup and payoff. There's actual research been done into the historical art of certain farts. Sidebar, I talked about this specifically on stream when I first got this book and we were just discussing it live. And that part, the way the letters were used, I found it a bit sad. There was just something about these personal letters that weren't ever really meant for public consumption, even though people have read them. I've read them. I'm part of the problem. But just something about them being used in this way and at points to make light of the man's historical legacy. At least that's how the jokes came off to me. Miles may vary. It just gave the same energy as if someone had taken one of the celebrity leaks where they pull nudes or something that was personal and not really meant to be seen, and then use that as fodder for the plot of something. This is entirely a me thing. Some people are gonna be totally fine with that and think that everything is just up for grabs, and that the contrast of his public persona and his private persona is funny and worth laughing at. I even saw some say that they thought he'd love this book. But enough about all of that. Back to the Fartacular. One's tolerance for lowbrow humor is also going to play a factor in this, because that is the majority of the jokes. And so for even some who may enjoy a lowbrow laugh every now and again, a fart joke, it may be overwhelming. And some may just not feel like they're just not well done fart jokes. But as for the big question, is this a fetish book? I'd say, regardless of the intent, it does end up being a fetishistic work. While again, that may not have been what the creators were aiming for, at the end of the day, it's a book that has a plot about smelling one's partner's farts, trying to get them to accept that that's a regular thing. The book has elements that one can actually rub and touch to smell the farts themselves at points on the images actually from the butt. There are activities such as tight clothing being worn where it then expands out because of all the gas. There's food being cooked with the farts at some points, fondue, both things that feature in explicit works of this kind. There's an entire section talking about an author who was a well-known fart fetishist, and there's a bit of a call to action at the end of the book to acknowledge and legitimize it. And because of all this, the book is clearly aware that this exists. So as a result, the entire package, the way that everything comes together, it does end up presenting a book that largely becomes a fetish book, even if unintentionally. Then the question becomes whether the reader feels this is appropriate or acceptable, which can turn into a whole separate discussion. Now, some may balk at that and not agree, or feel that the work really wasn't meant to be taken seriously, or that it's just an April Fool's joke, or that the intent of whatever the creators was, if it was to just create a joke book, should override the way that's being perceived by the public. However, once a work gets out there and it's open to interpretation from all different corners, its meaning may change. The way it's interpreted also becomes part of the story. It's not to say the intent doesn't matter, because it does, but ultimately the way it's received is going to be determined by the public at large. And so far, it's been deemed as a fetish book. Although maybe years later, there'll be a resurgence when people who don't have the voices to speak right now come up and be like, no, this was funny. Everybody back in 2025 was tripping. They were crashing out, as people say in 2025. Some people thought the announcement itself was the joke. Now, this isn't the first time that Harley has had a scratch and sniff gimmick comic. There was also the Harley Quinn Annual from 2014, which had a similar thing, only the smells were weed. So this is not a new gimmick for her. So there is also the potential that it was a return to something that's been tried before, because she's a character where they try these kind of more outlandish or kind of pushing the envelope things. It's just, overall, this doesn't quite land. And while some may dig it, or find it funny, or be purchasing it for other proclivities, at the end of the day, this is most likely going to end up being one of those footnote comics that people talk about and, oh, remember when they did the DC Harley Quinn Fartacular? How many of you remember the Weed Annual? The reaction to it is certainly overblown in terms of the way it's described as the end of all comics, or the end of Harley Quinn as a character, or a deliberate attempt to destroy comic fandom. Some things are hyperbolic. It can be hard to gauge genuine versus performative passion online. Most likely it's a joke that some thought was funny that doesn't really translate out into the wider scope of the world. People's perception and their experiences, a lot of that, as with anything, but especially with this, are going to impact how they receive this comic. There is also another factor to consider, which is that this makes good content. It's something that's going to get people curious, it's going to make a good thumbnail, one can create all kinds of titling for it, and the more hyperbolic, the better, at least in terms of content brain. I happen to find this interesting, and I do talk about these kind of more off the beaten path comics at times, so it was a happy marriage for me. But just in general, this is something you're gonna see make the rounds more because it is an oddity that one can then translate into really good SEO. So that factor does also need to be acknowledged, and it could be at play, and that's also why some think that this may have been rage bait. I wasn't able to find too much of the author talking about it, but when she does, she tends to talk about it very practically. And then there's the Harley Quinn Fartacular, Silent But Deadly, a 40-page April Fool's special in stores March 26th. Poison Ivy lets out a little toot and is terribly embarrassed, so Harley sets out to make a grand gesture, and maybe it involves stealing James Joyce's love letters. Overall, the reaction, while overblown, is understandable, especially given the landscape of the internet. And also because the topic being discussed is whether or not this is a kind of fetish book being snuck out there and potentially targeting people who are younger, which is what some feel. It does make the reaction that one is seeing make a bit more sense when viewed through that lens. Although, some people will also say that some people just love getting outraged on the internet. That's their hobby. I really wanted to discuss this one and get into it because with works like this, there tends to be very vocal, immediate reactions, and it can take a while for a work to kind of settle. So you'll get a lot of "that's disgusting" or "people are just overreacting and pretending." In the case of this book, even if someone did end up enjoying it or viewing it as lighthearted, it is most likely easy to see how someone could take it the other way. Potentially, maybe not. I'm so curious where this landed for all of you, and I can't wait to see the discussion. I've seen both. I've heard it both ways, but I have gone on for long enough. And now it's your turn to go on down the comments. Let's discuss. Let's have fun with it. The book is supposed to be fun, allegedly, so let's have some. Did you like this book and people need to chill out? Did you think it was disgusting and all of the things directed at are entirely true? Did you not care and not have a strong reaction at all? So, that was a ride. Thanks so much for taking some time to spend discussing comics with me. I always appreciate it, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.